So we can watch that again just so you can see. So you can see that the oscillation, the load here is pretty high with the chains. So you're getting a high rapid rate of oscillation. The movement down into the hold from the unracking or the bar is pretty quick. It's a very quick hold, and then it's a press back up. And so again, you can see because of the variables that are being manipulated, which is the load and the speed, the oscillation is really, really high. Okay. That kind of gets us into the topic of resonance and damping. And these are the two terms that I want to get into a little bit more specifically with respect to this presentation, just because I think the knowledge of these terms, and we don't have to get into the real nitty-gritty physics of this because it's not necessary to understand. However, we do have to kind of explain what these terms are and how they influence the oscillation. Okay. So I'll kind of just go over the slide. I do have a whiteboard. We will go through this on the whiteboard. So let me just get through the slide information first, and then we can kind of open it up. We can discuss this using some diagrams and a little bit better explanation so that you can see how this works within the respect of wave-like forces. Okay. So the first thing to consider with respect to resonance is that, and we'll specifically talk about this with respect to biology, and more specifically, obviously, biological tissues. So the literature does tell us that all biological tissues do have vibration. So they do vibrate to some level. And that's important for us to kind of know right off the bat. So if we're talking about connective tissue, if we're talking about muscle tissue, if we're talking about veins, arteries, nerves, if we're talking about bones, each one of those tissues does have a component of vibration or oscillation. So whenever they are loaded, they are not rigid structures. And that makes sense because they're biological in nature. So they're living structures. They are not cadavers. So whenever there is a force that is going through any element of biology, think about force being energy. There has to be a mechanism that we as humans can dissipate that energy to some extent. And so the way that we dissipate that energy is through vibration or oscillation. Okay. And so that oscillation and that vibration is what is called resonance. All right. As a matter of fact, it's not actually called resonance. It's just called harmonic oscillation. And we'll talk about that on the whiteboard. But that harmonic oscillation, which then becomes resonance, is how we dissipate force. Okay. More specifically, each one of those biological tissues has what is called a natural frequency. So this is how much they actually vibrate or oscillate. Okay. So if you think about rigid biological stuff like bone, obviously the natural frequency of oscillation or the amount of bone is going to move back and forth or up and down and vibrate is going to be a lot less than something a little bit softer in nature, like muscle tissue and or connective tissue. So those tissues will have a little bit more ability to vibrate or oscillate or move up and down or move back and forth to ultimately dissipate that force. So the amount of vibration or oscillation that exists in the particular tissue that allows it to most efficiently absorb and dissipate force is what is called the natural frequency of that tissue. Okay. So every tissue will have a specific natural frequency whereby it vibrates at a certain rate that allows for the dissipation of energy. Okay. Here's what we know even in more detail with respect to some of the biological tissues that we are trying to influence in the use of oscillatory isometrics. If you think about the bottom-up component of reactive strength, the bottom-up component of reactive strength is connective tissue. Okay. And the ability to create two specific characteristics of connective tissue. Number one is to have ultimately good organizational properties of connective tissue, such that the connective tissue is in alignment per se. I hate using that term specifically, but obviously we see in anatomy that there's a general map of connective tissue, and that general map is important because that allows for things like resonance to actually happen. Okay. So the first characteristic of connective tissue is good organization of it. And the second characteristic is the stiffness of it, or the ability of it to absorb force either very quickly or very slowly, to ultimately allow for the tissue to use energy and dissipate heat, essentially. Okay. And because of those two characteristics, which is the organization of tissue and then ultimately the stiffness of tissue, connective tissue is one specific component of biology whereby it has variable natural frequencies. So it will oscillate at different frequencies depending on the load. Okay. This is a really important concept with respect to oscillatory isometric muscle actions, because that means that we can use variable amounts of oscillation and still have effects, because the tissue will ultimately be able to do something with that oscillation and achieve whatever it is that we want the tissue to achieve. So one of the things that we've been asked specifically with respect to oscillatory isometric muscle actions is how much oscillation do we do? Or is there a specific amount of oscillation? And there isn't, because the amount of oscillation, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail a little bit later, but the amount of oscillation is dependent upon what you are trying to do. And what you are trying to do is dependent upon what behavior of tissue that you are trying to create. And therefore, if you have an idea of what your intent might be, that will create your oscillation. And even if that oscillation isn't exactly at the natural frequency of the tissue, because it has multiple variable infinite natural frequencies, will quickly tune to the oscillation, and you will get whatever effect that you're trying to get. Okay. So the important part that I want to just reiterate there is that for us as programmers that are going to use oscillation, intent will be important, and we will get to that. And realistically, there are going to be parameters that we can use for oscillation. It doesn't exactly have to be perfect, because if we can just stay in certain parameters, we will get the effect that we want to get because of the infinite nature of natural frequencies that exist specifically in connective tissue. Okay. There are two types of oscillation. There is the free oscillation. So this is what I just explained. This is just the natural frequency of what a tissue might oscillate at. And then there is forced oscillation, and that is what we are going to implement in the use of oscillation, because this is coming from some external force. And this external force will have to then drive the internal amount of oscillation. When you use an external force to drive an internal oscillation, you are creating resonance, and we'll get into that. Okay. So I'll stop the share there for now, and we can kind of just talk a little bit about what that means with respect to resonance. Any questions so far from anybody?
Okay. I just want to review something before you get into this. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So programming for reactive strength, the objective is bottom up. You mentioned is good organization of connective tissue. You hated to use the word alignment or in
Yes.
alignment, but it's just like, hey, is the composite of tissue there?
Yes. And does it go in the direction that it's supposed to go?
Okay. Two is the stiffness or the behavior or ability to absorb force to use that energy, that energy to dissipate force. Did I get that right? Or to dissipate
Yeah.
heat? What it
It's to dissipate heat. I said dissipate heat.
Yeah, you said dissipate heat. Okay, I wrote down force. That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
Okay, so the only other question that I have is there's two types of oscillations. One is the force internal, which is the natural frequency.
Mhm.
That natural frequency of force, is that getting fed up into the neural network?
Great question. Probably not. Probably not. And that's why we have to create a force that enhances the natural frequency or that matches the natural frequency, because then it might actually get into the neural network. And so I'll talk about this on the whiteboard, but ideally what you're doing when you match the natural frequency of a particular biological tissue, you enhance the amplitude of the wave, right? And if you
Hmm.
enhance the amplitude of the wave, now it kind of takes that natural frequency and makes it bigger. So now it becomes more, has the potential to be more represented within the neural network.
Right. Okay. Okay. Because I think that's important for oscillatory isometrics in people that have like pathology or you know that there's suboptimal organization.
Well, let me just, so we'll get into that, but that just means that once you, once we kind of go through resonance and the damping effect, if you have somebody that has pathological connective tissue, there are certain parameters that you would want to oscillate that tissue at. And you have to
Right.
make sure that you stay within those parameters.